The city throbbed with a restless energy. Rain, a persistent drizzle that had begun before dawn, slicked the cobblestone streets and painted the towering buildings in muted grays and browns. In the heart of it all, nestled amongst vintage boutiques and bustling cafes, stood a modest red brick building, Jonathan's Properties. The brass plaque beside the heavy oak door gleamed faintly despite the overcast sky, a testament to Jonathan's meticulous nature. Inside, the office was a reflection of its owner, orderly, predictable, and steeped in a bygone era. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, adorned with framed photographs of properties Jonathan had managed for decades. A large mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface polished to a mirror sheen, save for a neatly arranged stack of files and a pen holder crafted from a single piece of intricately carved wood. The air hung heavy with the scent of old paper, leather-bound books lining a small shelf in the corner, and a faint, lingering aroma of pipe tobacco, a habit Jonathan had reluctantly curtailed, but whose ghost still permeated the space. Jonathan himself sat behind the desk, a man in his late 50s, his silver hair neatly combed back, his attire impeccable, a crisp white shirt, a subtly patterned tie, and a tweed jacket that spoke of quiet affluence and traditional values. He was reviewing a tenant application, his brow furrowed slightly in concentration. Jonathan was a creature of habit, a man who found comfort in routine and predictability. This extended to his tenants. He preferred individuals who, in his mind, embodied stability and respectability. Professionals, families, people who appreciated the character and history he so often touted when describing his properties. But beneath this veneer of orderliness and calculated civility lay a more insidious trait, a deeply ingrained prejudice, subtle yet potent. It wasn't expressed in blatant slurs or overt discrimination. Instead, it manifested in a quiet filtering process, an unconscious bias that colored his perceptions and steered his decisions. He sought tenants who mirrored his own world, a world largely homogeneous, a world he understood and felt comfortable within. Diversity, in Jonathan's unspoken worldview, was often equated with disruption, with the unsettling unknown. The application he held was for apartment 3B in the Oakhaven building, a charming pre-war structure with ornate cornices and generous windows overlooking a small, leafy square. He scanned the document, noting the applicant's name, Eleanor Davies, a young architect, judging by her listed profession. He nodded slowly, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Architect. Respectable. Creative, perhaps, but within acceptable boundaries. He imagined her fitting in seamlessly, another piece in the carefully curated tapestry of his tenant base. A soft chime from the reception area announced a visitor. Jonathan straightened his tie, smoothed down his jacket, and composed his features into a welcoming yet professional expression. He prided himself on his courteousness, on the impression he gave of being a fair and discerning landlord. Prejudice, after all, was an ugly word, one he would vehemently deny applying to himself. He was simply discerning. He selected tenants who were the right fit, and right fit in Jonathan's mind was a reflection of himself, his values, and his unspoken preferences. The door to his office opened, and his receptionist, Mrs. Higgins, a woman as steadfast and predictable as Jonathan himself, ushered in the next applicant. Mrs. Higgins, with a polite nod, announced, "Mr. Jonathan, Mr. Marcus Bell is here to inquire about apartment 3B. She stepped aside, and Marcus entered the office. Jonathan's carefully constructed cordiality faltered, just imperceptibly, like a skipped beat in a familiar rhythm. He had expected Eleanor Davies. He hadn't consciously registered the name Marcus Bell on the appointment schedule, or perhaps he had, and it hadn't registered in a way that truly prepared him for this Marcus Bell. Marcus was a young man, radiating an aura of quiet confidence. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tasteful blue tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the muted light of the office. He carried a slim leather portfolio case, and his posture was upright, his gaze direct and engaging. He extended a hand towards Jonathan, a warm, genuine smile gracing his features. Good afternoon, Mr. Jonathan. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for seeing me. His voice was articulate, well-modulated, carrying a hint of an urban accent, but devoid of any slang or unprofessionalism. Jonathan, momentarily thrown off balance, recovered quickly. He shook Marcus's hand, his grip firm, but his smile felt less genuine, more practiced. "Mr. Bell," he responded, his tone cordial, but a shade cooler than it had been moments before in anticipation of Eleanor Davies. "Please, have a seat." He gestured towards a leather armchair opposite his desk. As Marcus settled into the chair, Jonathan's eyes, though seemingly polite, conducted a subtle, almost imperceptible assessment. He noted Marcus's skin tone, dark, rich, undeniably black. A wave of unspoken, unconscious bias washed over him. It wasn't animosity, not overt hatred. It was something far more insidious, a subtle discomfort, a feeling of otherness. His mind, trained by years of ingrained societal prejudices and his own self-imposed limitations, began to categorize, to subtly diminish Marcus in his perception. "So, Mr. Bell," Jonathan began, leaning back in his chair, adopting a posture of detached professionalism. "You are interested in apartment 3B in the Oakhaven building, I understand?" "Yes, sir, very much so," Marcus replied, his enthusiasm undiminished. "I saw the listing online and the location is perfect for me. I work in the tech district, and it's just a short commute, and the building itself looks absolutely charming, full of character. I especially appreciate the architectural details from that era." Jonathan listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention was divided. He heard the words, the positive attributes Marcus was highlighting, the genuine interest in the property, but his mind was already working on a different track, formulating a polite yet firm rejection. He noticed the quality of Marcus's suit, the expensive watch on his wrist, the confidence in his demeanor. Objectively, Marcus seemed like an ideal tenant, professional, articulate, clearly financially stable. All the boxes on Jonathan's usual checklist were being ticked, except for one unspoken, deeply ingrained box, the box of his own prejudice. He thought of his current tenants in Oakhaven, the retired schoolteacher, Mrs. Henderson, on the ground floor, the young couple, the Smiths, on the second. All familiar faces, all fitting neatly into his preconceived notions of good tenants. Marcus, despite his obvious qualifications, felt different, disruptive to the comfortable homogeneity he had cultivated. "I must say, Mr. Bell," Jonathan interjected, his tone carefully neutral, "there has been a considerable amount of interest in apartment 3B. It is a very desirable unit, as you can appreciate." He allowed a pause to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. He was laying the groundwork for his rejection, cloaking it in the guise of high demand, a common landlord tactic. But for Jonathan, it was more than just a tactic. It was a shield, a justification for his prejudice, a way to avoid confronting the ugliness within himself. Marcus, perceptive and attuned to social nuances, subtly registered the shift in Jonathan's demeanor. The initial cordiality had thinned, replaced by a guarded reserve. He sensed an undercurrent, something unspoken, a barrier erected between them that had nothing to do with the merits of his application. He pressed on, however, determined to present himself in the best possible light. "I understand, Mr. Jonathan. It's a lovely apartment, and I'm sure there are many applicants. I've brought my portfolio with me if you'd like to review it." He opened his leather case and offered a neatly organized folder containing his resume, references, and financial documentation. "I have excellent credit, a stable job in a leading tech company, and glowing references from my previous landlords." Jonathan took the folder, more out of obligation than genuine interest. He glanced at the documents, his eyes skimming over the impressive credentials. A degree from a prestigious university, a successful career trajectory, letters of recommendation praising Marcus's responsibility and integrity. Objectively, it was a stellar application. Any rational landlord would be thrilled to have such a tenant. But rationality was losing out to prejudice. Jonathan's mind was already made up. He was searching for a reason, any reason, to justify his predetermined decision. He flipped through the pages, pretending to study them intently, while his thoughts raced, concocting a plausible excuse. "Everything seems in order, Mr. Bell," Jonathan said finally, placing the folder back on his desk, avoiding direct eye contact with Marcus. "You certainly have an impressive profile." The words felt hollow, perfunctory, lacking genuine warmth or enthusiasm. Marcus allowed himself a flicker of hope. Perhaps he had misread the initial coolness. Perhaps Jonathan was simply a reserved individual. "Thank you, Mr. Jonathan. I am very interested in becoming a tenant at Oakhaven. I truly appreciate the character of the building and the sense of community I get from this neighborhood." He gestured vaguely towards the window, encompassing the charming street outside. Jonathan sighed internally. Marcus was making it difficult to maintain his contrived excuse. His genuine enthusiasm was almost disarming. But prejudice, once rooted, is a stubborn weed. He cleared his throat, preparing to deliver the blow. "However, Mr. Bell," he began, his tone now laced with a practiced regret, "I must inform you that, unfortunately, apartment 3B is no longer available." Marcus's hopeful expression faltered, replaced by a look of quiet disappointment, but no surprise. He had sensed this coming, the subtle cues, the shift in tone, the lack of genuine engagement. They had all pointed towards this outcome. "Oh," Marcus said, his voice measured, betraying only a hint of his disappointment. "I understand. That's unfortunate. I was under the impression from the online listing that it was still available." Jonathan offered a thin, unconvincing smile. "Yes, well, these things can change quickly. We just received another application. Earlier this morning, in fact, and it has been accepted." He invented the lie on the spot, the words feeling clumsy and unconvincing even to his own ears. He avoided Marcus's gaze, focusing instead on rearranging the pens in his pen. "Holder." "I see," Marcus replied, his voice calm, controlled. He didn't challenge Jonathan's flimsy excuse. He didn't argue or plead. He simply accepted it with a dignity that spoke volumes. He knew, instinctively, that further discussion would be futile. He understood the unspoken language of prejudice, the subtle rejections that were often more painful than outright hostility. He rose from his chair, extending his hand once more towards Jonathan. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Jonathan. I appreciate you seeing me." His handshake was still firm, his gaze direct, but now tinged with a quiet sadness. Jonathan shook his hand again, feeling a fleeting pang of guilt, quickly suppressed. "Of course, Mr. Bell. We wish you the best in your apartment search." The words were empty, perfunctory, utterly devoid of sincerity. Marcus turned and walked towards the door, his posture still erect, his dignity intact. As he reached the threshold, he paused, turning back to Jonathan for a brief moment. His eyes met Jonathan's, and in that fleeting glance, Jonathan saw not accusation, not anger, but a quiet understanding, a profound awareness of the prejudice that had just cost Marcus a home. Then Marcus was gone, leaving Jonathan alone in the silence of his office, the rain continuing to patter against the window panes, a melancholic soundtrack to his quiet act of injustice. The office door clicked shut behind Marcus, and a heavy silence descended upon the room. Jonathan remained seated behind his desk, the folder containing Marcus's application still lying untouched, a stark reminder of the encounter. He felt a strange mix of emotions, a fleeting sense of relief, a familiar comfort in having averted what he perceived as a potential disruption to his carefully curated tenant base, and a nagging unease, a whisper of guilt that he quickly tried to suppress. He told himself he had done the right thing. Apartment 3B was a prized unit. He needed a tenant who was the right fit, someone who would appreciate the building's history, someone who would blend seamlessly into the existing community. In his mind, Marcus, despite his qualifications, was still an unknown quantity, an element that felt foreign. This was his property, his domain. He had the right to choose who lived within it, didn't he? He busied himself with paperwork, shuffling files, making phone calls, trying to distract himself from the lingering image of Marcus's dignified disappointment. He told himself it was just business. Landlords made decisions based on various factors, He had simply chosen another applicant who was a better fit. He repeated the phrase in his mind, better fit, trying to convince himself of its validity, even as a small voice within him whispered of the true reason for his rejection. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the window panes, mirroring the disquiet in Jonathan's mind. He glanced out at the street, the gray cityscape reflecting his own internal gloom. He thought of Marcus walking away in the rain, searching for another place to call home, carrying the sting of unspoken prejudice. The thought pricked at his conscience, but he pushed it away, retreating further into the familiar comfort of his biases. Meanwhile, Marcus walked out of Jonathan's properties and into the rain-soaked street. He pulled up the collar of his suit, jacket, shielding himself from the persistent drizzle. He didn't hail a taxi. He simply started walking, his footsteps echoing on the wet cobblestones, his mind replaying the encounter in Jonathan's office. He wasn't surprised by the rejection. He had experienced similar subtle discriminations before, navigating a world that often judged him not by his merits, but by the color of his skin. It was a familiar sting, a dull ache of injustice that had become a part of his life experience. He had learned to anticipate it, to brace himself for it, to not let it define him, but it still hurt. Every time, he replayed Jonathan's polite yet distant demeanor, the contrived excuse, the lack of genuine engagement. He recognized the subtle cues, the unspoken language of prejudice. It wasn't overt hostility, not the blatant racism of past generations. It was something quieter, more insidious. A subtle closing of doors, a quiet denial of opportunity, masked by civility and veiled excuses. He felt a pang of disappointment. He had genuinely liked the Oakhaven building, its location, its character. He had envisioned himself living there, building a home in that community. Now that possibility was gone, snatched away by a prejudice he could not control, a bias he could not overcome. But beneath the disappointment, there was also a quiet resilience. Marcus was not one to be defeated by prejudice. He had faced challenges before, and he would face them again. He would find another apartment. He would find a place where he was welcomed, not just tolerated. He would continue to build his life, his career, his future, despite the obstacles placed in his path by the Jonathans of the world. He would not let their prejudice define him. Instead, he would use it as fuel, as motivation to prove them wrong, to succeed despite their limitations, to build a life of dignity and purpose, a life that would ultimately speak louder than their quiet acts of injustice. Weeks turned into months. Autumn arrived, painting the city in hues of gold and crimson. The Oakhaven apartment 3B remained vacant. Jonathan, despite his initial relief, had not found a replacement tenant. The other application he had fabricated for Marcus had never materialized into a signed lease. He had shown the apartment to a few other prospective tenants, all fitting his preferred demographic. White, professional, seemingly stable. But none of them had quite worked out. One found the rent too high. Another disliked the layout. Another decided the neighborhood wasn't quite vibrant enough. Excuses, just like the ones Jonathan himself had offered Marcus, now coming back to haunt him in a subtle, ironic twist. The apartment sat empty, a silent, echoing void in the Oakhaven building. Jonathan tried to rationalize it. The rental market was a bit slow this season, he told himself. It was just a matter of time before the right tenant came along. He lowered the rent slightly, relisted the apartment online, and waited. But the weeks continued to pass, and the apartment remained stubbornly vacant. The silence was starting to become unsettling. He walked through the empty unit occasionally, trying to understand why it was proving so difficult to rent. The hardwood floors gleamed, the large windows offered a pleasant view of the square, the pre-war charm was still undeniably present. Objectively, it was a desirable apartment. Yet, it remained empty. The lack of rental income from 3B began to pinch. Property taxes were due, maintenance costs were mounting, and the general expenses of managing his properties were a constant drain. Jonathan, accustomed to a steady stream of rental income, started to feel the financial pressure. He tightened his belt, postponed some minor repairs on other properties, and hoped for a breakthrough soon. He started to feel a growing unease, a sense that something was amiss. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the vacant apartment felt like more than just a temporary inconvenience. It felt like a tangible manifestation of something wrong. He dismissed the thought as irrational, attributing it to stress and financial worries. He avoided thinking about Marcus. The memory of their brief encounter was tucked away in a corner of his mind, a source of discomfort he preferred not to revisit. He had made his decision, and he had to live with it. He couldn't afford to dwell on what-ifs or second-guess his judgment, but the vacant apartment was a persistent reminder, a silent accusation. Every time he reviewed his financial statements, every time he walked past the empty unit in Oakhaven, he was confronted with the tangible consequence of his prejudice. The silence of apartment 3B echoed not just through the building, but also in the recesses of his own conscience. A quiet, persistent hum of unease that refused to be silenced. The autumn leaves fell, and winter loomed, casting a long shadow over Jonathan's properties, and the vacant echoes of apartment 3B grew louder in his ears. Winter descended upon the city with an icy grip. Snow fell in thick blankets, blanketing the cobblestone streets and frosting the window panes of Jonathan's properties. The charm of the pre-war buildings, once so appealing, now seemed to wear a veneer of cold austerity. The vacant apartment 3B felt even colder, a drafty, uninhabited space that mirrored the chill in Jonathan's finances. The mounting expenses were no longer just a pinch, they were becoming a serious strain. Heating bills soared, snow removal, costs piled up, and a pipe burst in another property, requiring emergency repairs. Jonathan's carefully managed finances were starting to unravel. He had dipped into his reserves, and those reserves were dwindling rapidly. The vacant apartment, once a minor inconvenience, now loomed large as a symbol of his financial woes. The lost rental income was no longer negligible. It was becoming a significant deficit. He had stubbornly clung to his prejudice, rejecting a perfectly qualified tenant, and now he was paying the price, literally. Desperation began to creep in. Jonathan started to consider options he would have previously dismissed. He thought about lowering the rent further, advertising more aggressively, perhaps even compromising on his tenant selection criteria. The thought was unsettling, a crack in the carefully constructed wall of his biases. He reread Marcus's application, the folder still lying on his desk, a silent reproach. He scanned the impressive resume, the glowing references, the clear evidence of financial stability. Objectively, Marcus was the ideal tenant. He had rejected him not for any legitimate reason, but solely because of his prejudice. The realization was stark, undeniable, and deeply uncomfortable. He wrestled with his conscience. Could he bring himself to reconsider? Could he swallow his pride, acknowledge his error, and reach out to Marcus? The thought was humiliating, a direct confrontation with his own failings. His ingrained prejudice whispered against it, urging him to find another way, any other way, to solve his financial problems without admitting his mistake. He tried other avenues. He contacted a rental agency, hoping they could find a suitable tenant quickly. But the agency, sensing his desperation, quoted exorbitant fees and offered little guarantee of success. He considered selling the Oakhaven building altogether, but the thought was even more unpalatable. Oakhaven was one of his prized properties, a symbol of his success, his legacy. Selling it would feel like admitting defeat, a public acknowledgement of his financial troubles. He was trapped, caught between his pride, his prejudice, and his mounting desperation. Winter's chill seemed to seep into his bones, mirroring the cold dread that settled in his heart. He was facing a crisis of his own making, a direct consequence of his own deeply flawed judgment. The vacant apartment 3B, once just an empty space, now felt like a gaping hole in his finances, in his carefully constructed world. A stark and undeniable testament to the costly consequences of prejudice. The silence of Winter was punctuated only by the growing hum of his financial anxiety and the persistent nagging voice of his conscience, whispering the name he had tried so hard to forget. Marcus Bell. One blustery winter afternoon, Jonathan received a call from Mr. Henderson, a long-standing client, a reputable businessman whose company occupied a significant commercial space in one of Jonathan's larger buildings. Mr. Henderson was usually affable and straightforward, but today his voice held an unusual warmth, almost effusiveness. "Jonathan, my dear fellow, I wanted to call and express my sincere gratitude. You wouldn't believe the bind we were in with that Henderson tech project. Absolutely critical deadline, and our lead programmer, bless his soul, fell ill at the worst possible time. We were facing a potential disaster, Jonathan. A real reputational hit." Jonathan listened, puzzled. He knew Mr. Henderson's company was involved in a major project, but he wasn't privy to the details. He murmured polite acknowledgments, wondering where this conversation was leading. And then, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice rising with enthusiasm. Young Marcus Bell stepped in. A consultant, apparently. Brilliant young man. He practically saved the day, Jonathan. Turned the whole project around, worked day and night, delivered beyond our expectations. The Henderson tech deal is back on track, thanks entirely to Marcus. The entire team is singing his praises. Remarkable young man. Truly remarkable. Jonathan felt a cold jolt run through him. Marcus Bell. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. He vaguely remembered the applicant for apartment 3B, the well-dressed young man, the impressive portfolio. Could it be the same, Marcus Bell? The coincidence seemed improbable, yet undeniable. He stammered, "Marcus Bell? You mean Marcus Bell, the consultant?" "Yes, that's him." "Do you know him, Jonathan?" Mr. Henderson asked, his tone curious. Jonathan's mind raced. He couldn't admit, not to Mr. Henderson, the respected client, that he had rejected this remarkable young man based on nothing but prejudice. He mumbled something non-committal. "Vaguely. I think I may have encountered him professionally in the past." A blatant lie, but he couldn't bring himself to confess the truth. Mr. Henderson continued to sing Marcus's praises, oblivious to Jonathan's growing discomfort. He spoke of Marcus's intelligence, his work ethic, his professionalism, his positive attitude, his ability to solve complex problems under pressure. Every word was like a hammer blow to Jonathan's conscience. "You know, Jonathan," Mr. Henderson concluded, "you should try to hire this young man yourself. He's a real asset. Talent like that is hard to find. And a genuinely good person too, you know. Down to earth, humble, despite all his brilliance. A real pleasure to work with." The call ended, leaving Jonathan in stunned silence. The phone felt heavy in his hand, the words Marcus Bell echoing in his mind like a deafening alarm. He sat frozen, staring blankly at the snow-covered street outside his office window. The twist of fate was cruel, ironic, and utterly devastating. The man he had rejected, the man he had dismissed based on prejudice, had just been lauded as a remarkable young man, a brilliant professional, a real asset by one of his most important clients. The financial implications of his prejudice suddenly became starkly clear. He had not just committed a social injustice, he had made a colossal business blunder. He had closed the door on a potentially valuable tenant, and in doing so, had potentially damaged his own reputation, alienated a respected client, and exacerbated his already precarious financial situation. The winter chill suddenly felt less external and more internal, a deep, icy dread that settled in his soul as the full weight of his costly error crashed down upon him. The revelation from Mr. Henderson hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He sat in stunned silence, the phone still clutched in his hand, the echoes of Mr. Henderson's praise for Marcus ringing in his ears. The bitter pill of realization was hard to swallow, but impossible to ignore. He had been so blinded by his prejudice that he had completely missed the obvious. Marcus Bell was not just a qualified tenant, he was a highly qualified individual, a valuable professional, a person of integrity and talent, as evidenced by Mr. Henderson's glowing endorsement. And Jonathan, in his narrow-mindedness, had dismissed him out of hand, based on nothing but the color of his skin. The financial consequences were no longer just abstract worries. They were now sharply defined, linked directly to his prejudice. He had lost rental income, yes, but he had also potentially damaged his relationship with a key client. What if Mr. Henderson, upon realizing Jonathan's connection to the Oak Haven building and Marcus's thwarted tenancy, drew his own conclusions. What if it affected their business relationship? The thought sent a shiver of cold fear down Jonathan's spine. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, a deep, burning humiliation. He, Jonathan, the discerning landlord, the man of traditional values, had been exposed as prejudiced, narrow-minded, and foolish. His carefully constructed facade of civility and fairness crumbled, revealing the ugly truth beneath. He replayed the encounter with Marcus in his mind, every detail now sharpened. By the harsh light of hindsight, he remembered Marcus's genuine enthusiasm for the apartment, his impeccable presentation, his quiet dignity in the face of rejection, and he remembered his own contrived excuse, his dismissive demeanor, his unspoken prejudice. The memory was now a source of acute self-reproach. He paced his office, agitated and restless. He had to do something. He couldn't simply ignore this revelation, pretend it hadn't happened. The financial pressure was mounting, and now, the ethical and professional implications were equally pressing. He considered his options. He could try to forget about it, bury the shame, and hope that Mr. Henderson never connected the dots. But that felt cowardly, dishonest, and ultimately unsustainable. The vacant apartment was still a gaping hole in his finances, and the knowledge of his error was now a gaping hole in his conscience. He knew deep down what he had to do. It was the hardest thing he could imagine, the ultimate test of his character. He had to apologize. He had to reach out to Marcus Bell, admit his mistake, and offer him the apartment again. The thought was deeply unsettling, almost physically painful. It meant confronting his prejudice head-on, acknowledging his failings, and exposing himself to potential rejection and humiliation. But he knew it was the right thing to do, both morally and practically. He had to try to rectify his error, to undo the damage he had caused, both to Marcus and to himself. He sat down at his desk, his hand trembling slightly, and reached for the phone. He found Marcus's application folder, and his business card was still clipped inside. He stared at the name, Marcus Bell, printed in crisp, professional lettering. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the uncomfortable task ahead. He had to make the call. He had to take the first step towards redemption, however difficult and humiliating it might be. The bitter pill of realization had been swallowed. Now he had to face the consequences and try to make amends. Jonathan dialed the number on Marcus's business card, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited, each ring of the phone amplifying his anxiety, his self-doubt. What would Marcus say? Would he even answer? Would he hang up on him? The possibilities raced through his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Finally, the ringing stopped and a voice answered, calm and professional. Marcus Bell speaking. Jonathan's throat constricted. He swallowed hard, trying to compose himself. Mr. Bell, he began, his voice slightly shaky. This is Jonathan Davies, from Jonathan's Properties. We spoke a few months ago about apartment 3B at Oakhaven. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, a moment of silence. That felt heavy with unspoken meaning. Jonathan braced himself for a curt dismissal, a cold rejection. But Marcus's voice, when it came, was measured, polite, and surprisingly neutral. Yes, Mr. Davies, I remember. There was no warmth, no enthusiasm, just a quiet acknowledgement of the previous encounter. Jonathan pressed on, forcing himself to speak the words he had rehearsed in his mind, the words that felt like shards of glass in his mouth. Mr. Bell, I am calling to apologize. For the way I handled your application for apartment 3B, I was wrong. I made a mistake, a serious mistake. Another pause, longer this time. Jonathan could almost hear Marcus's thoughts processing his words, assessing his sincerity. He held his breath, waiting for the inevitable rejection, the justified anger. But Marcus's response was again surprisingly measured and devoid of overt hostility. Mr. Davies, he said, his voice still calm, I appreciate you calling. It is not often that someone in your position offers an apology in such circumstances. Jonathan felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the darkness of his self-reproach. "Mr. Bell," he continued, his voice gaining a little more strength, "I have come to realize that my decision regarding your application was prejudiced, based on assumptions and biases that were completely unfounded and unfair. I was wrong to reject you. You were clearly the most qualified applicant, and I let my own prejudice cloud my judgment." He rushed on, pouring out his confession, his regret, his shame. He told Marcus about his conversation with Mr. Henderson, about the glowing praise he had heard, about the stark realization of his costly error. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to minimize his prejudice. He simply laid bare his mistake, hoping for a modicum of understanding, a sliver of forgiveness. "Mr. Bell," he concluded, his voice now thick with emotion, "Apartment 3B is still vacant. It has been vacant ever since you applied, and I would like to offer it to you, if you are still interested, of course. I understand if you are not, but I wanted to offer it, to try to rectify my mistake in some small way." He held his breath again, waiting for Marcus's response, his fate hanging in the balance. He had offered his apology, a tentative olive branch extended across the chasm of his prejudice. Now, it was up to Marcus to decide whether to accept it or to let it wither and fall. The silence on the other end of the line stretched agonizingly before Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, considered, and carrying a quiet dignity that resonated deeply with Jonathan's remorseful heart. Marcus listened to Jonathan's apology, his words carefully chosen, his tone sincere and laced with genuine regret. He had expected anger, defensiveness, or perhaps even a denial of prejudice if Jonathan ever contacted him again. He certainly hadn't anticipated an apology, let alone an offer to reconsider his application. He felt a complex mix of emotions, a sense of vindication, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his qualifications had ultimately been recognized, even if belatedly. But there was also a lingering sadness, a reminder of the initial sting of rejection, the injustice he had faced, and the time and effort he had wasted searching for another home. He considered Jonathan's offer. Apartment 3B was still appealing. The location was convenient, the building charming, and the rent, he assumed, would be the same as originally advertised. Part of him, the pragmatic part, considered accepting. It would solve his immediate housing needs, and it would be a form of retribution, a tangible consequence for Jonathan's prejudice. But another part of him, the part that valued dignity and self-respect, hesitated. He had moved on. He had found another apartment, a place where he felt welcomed, not just tolerated. He had built a new sense of community, a network of friends and colleagues who appreciated him for who he was, not for who they expected him to be. To go back to Oakhaven now, to become Jonathan's tenant after this belated apology, felt complicated. It felt like accepting a consolation prize, a gesture of guilt-ridden obligation, rather than genuine welcome. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, and responded to Jonathan, his voice calm and measured, reflecting his inner composure. "Mr. Davies," he said, "thank you. Thank you for your apology. I appreciate your call, and I acknowledge your sincerity. It takes courage to admit a mistake like that, and I respect you for it." Jonathan's relief was palpable, even over the phone line. "Thank you, Mr. Bell. It means a great deal to me to hear you say that." Marcus continued, his tone remaining polite but firm. "However, Mr. Davies, in the month since our initial meeting, I have found another place. I have signed a lease elsewhere and have already settled in. It's a lovely community, and I am very happy there." He didn't elaborate, didn't mention the welcoming atmosphere, or the sense of belonging he now felt. He didn't need to. The unspoken message was clear. Jonathan's initial relief faltered, replaced by a renewed sense of disappointment, but also understanding. "I see," he said, his voice subdued. "I understand, Mr. Bell. Of course, You have moved on. That is perfectly understandable. He felt a pang of regret, a missed opportunity that was now irrevocably lost. I wish you all the best in your new home, Mr. Bell, Jonathan added, his tone sincere. And again, I apologize for my mistake. I hope that one day you might consider giving me another chance, should you ever be looking for a property again. A faint glimmer of hope still lingered, despite the graceful rejection. Marcus smiled. Faintly, a sad, knowing smile that Jonathan couldn't see. Thank you, Mr. Davies. I appreciate that. Perhaps in the future. But for now, I am where I need to be. He paused, then added with a gentle firmness, I hope, Mr. Davies, that this experience serves as a valuable lesson for you. Prejudice. It is not only morally wrong, but as you have discovered, it can also be costly. The line went silent for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Then, Marcus spoke, again, his voice softening slightly. Thank you for calling, Mr. Davies. I wish you well. And with that, he politely ended the call, leaving Jonathan alone in the silence of his office, the phone once again heavy in his hand. The lesson, learned finally and definitively. Jonathan slowly lowered the phone, the dial tone buzzing in his ear, a stark reminder of the finality of Marcus's polite rejection. He sat back in his chair, staring out at the snow-covered cityscape, the winter afternoon now deepening into dusk. The empty apartment 3B, he knew, would remain empty, a constant, tangible reminder of his costly prejudice. But something had shifted within him. The shame, the guilt, the self-reproach were still present, but they were now accompanied by a new emotion, a dawning sense of understanding, a nascent empathy, a flicker of genuine remorse that went beyond mere financial regret. Marcus's graceful rejection, his quiet dignity, his measured words, they had resonated deeply with Jonathan. He had expected anger, accusation, perhaps even gloating. Instead, he had received politeness, understanding, and a gentle yet firm lesson in the consequences of prejudice. Marcus's graciousness was perhaps more impactful, more humbling, than any angry condemnation could have been. Jonathan thought about Marcus's words. Prejudice. It is not only morally wrong, but as you have discovered, it can also be costly. The truth of that statement hit him with full force. He had lost rental income, yes. He had potentially damaged his professional reputation, but he had lost something far more valuable, the opportunity to welcome a good man, a valuable member of the community, into his property. He had allowed his prejudice to blind him to Marcus's humanity, his potential, his worth. And in doing so, he had diminished himself, his business, and his own humanity. He thought about his existing tenants in Oakhaven, the carefully curated collection of individuals who mirrored his own world. They were comfortable, predictable, familiar, but they were also homogeneous. He had created a world of sameness, a world devoid of the richness and vibrancy that diversity could bring. He had closed himself off to new perspectives, new experiences, new possibilities. And he had suffered for it, both financially and personally. He looked around his office, the dark wood paneling, the leather-bound books, the artifacts of a bygone era. It was a comfortable space, a reflection of his own comfortable, predictable worldview. But it was also limiting. It was a world built on exclusion, on unspoken biases, on the fear of the other. He realized with a dawning clarity that prejudice was not just about harming others, it was about harming oneself. It was about closing doors, limiting opportunities, stifling growth, and ultimately, impoverishing one's own life. He had been so focused on preserving his comfortable homogeneity that he had failed to see the richness and value that diversity could offer. The empty apartment 3B, once a symbol of his financial loss, now became a symbol of something more profound, a symbol of his missed opportunity, his costly error, and the transformative lesson he had finally and painfully learned. The winter chill outside still nipped at the windows, but inside Jonathan's office and within Jonathan's heart, a slow thaw had begun. The emptiness of the apartment was juxtaposed with a growing fullness in his understanding, a nascent desire to change, to learn, to open himself to a wider, more diverse, and ultimately richer world. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring and then to summer. The city bloomed again, vibrant and alive. Jonathan, too, underwent a quiet transformation. The lesson of Marcus Bell and the emptiness of apartment 3B had taken root, slowly but surely changing his perspective, his approach to his business and his view of the world. He didn't suddenly become a champion of diversity overnight. Prejudice, deeply ingrained, doesn't vanish in an instant, but a seed of awareness had been planted. A crack had appeared in the wall of his biases, allowing a glimmer of light to penetrate. He started to consciously challenge his own assumptions, his own ingrained preferences. When reviewing tenant applications, he made a deliberate effort to focus solely on qualifications, on objective criteria, consciously pushing aside any unconscious biases that might creep in. He sought advice from colleagues, from community leaders, educating himself on issues of diversity and inclusion, listening to perspectives different from his own. He revisited his marketing materials, his website, his office decor, subtly updating them to reflect a more inclusive and welcoming image. He instructed Mrs. Higgins, his steadfast receptionist, to ensure that all applicants, regardless of background, were treated with equal courtesy and respect. He even reached out to local community organizations, exploring ways to partner with them to promote diversity and affordable housing in his properties. The change was gradual, incremental, but noticeable. New tenants began to move into his buildings, a more diverse mix of individuals, families, and backgrounds. Initially, Jonathan felt a slight unease, a lingering sense of discomfort with the unfamiliar, but he persevered, reminding himself of the lesson he had learned, the costly consequences of his prejudice, and the potential richness that diversity could bring. Slowly, subtly, his perspective shifted. He began to see the benefits of diversity, not just in a theoretical, abstract sense, but in tangible, real-world ways. His tenant base became more vibrant, more dynamic, more engaged. New ideas, new perspectives, new energies flowed into his properties, enriching the community and creating a more welcoming atmosphere for all. And surprisingly, his financial situation also improved. The vacant apartment 3B was eventually rented to a young artist, a woman of color, who brought a creative energy and a vibrant spirit to the Oakhaven building. Word spread that Jonathan's properties was becoming more open, more inclusive, more welcoming to all. Occupancy rates increased, tenant satisfaction improved, and Jonathan's business began to thrive again in a way it hadn't for years. He never forgot Marcus Bell. The name remained a quiet reminder, a personal touchstone, a symbol of his past prejudice and his hard-earned lesson. He often wondered where Marcus was, what he was doing, hoping that he had found a truly welcoming community, a place where his talents and his humanity were fully appreciated. Jonathan's tale became a quiet legend within his own circle, a story he occasionally shared, not to boast of his transformation, but to humbly acknowledge his past failings and to underscore the profound lesson he had learned. He understood finally that embracing diversity was not just a matter of social justice. It was a matter of personal and professional enrichment. It was about opening doors, not closing them. It was about embracing the richness of human experience, in all its forms, and recognizing that true prosperity, both personal and professional, lies not in homogeneity and exclusion, but in diversity, inclusion, and the boundless potential of an open heart and an open mind. The empty apartment had finally been filled, not just with a tenant, but with a profound and transformative understanding, a realization that prejudice closes doors, but embracing diversity opens them, leading to growth, prosperity, and a richer, more meaningful life for all.